Hello, my name is Samantha Will, and this is my presentation on the Alaskan Senate Race 2020. So I'll start off by introducing the candidates. I'm just going to be focusing on the two major candidates, which are Dan Sullivan, the Republican, and Al Gross, the Democrat. So there was an independent running for this position as well, but he did not get much publicity, so I just thought I'd focus on these main two candidates. So Dan Sullivan is the incumbent senator. He has a pretty extensive political and military history. Before becoming a U.S. senator, he worked as Alaska's Attorney General, Commissioner of the Alaskan Department of Natural Resources, served as a judicial law clerk on various courts in Alaska, served in the U.S. Marine Corps, worked as the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Economic, Energy, and Business under Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, and also was the director in the International Economics Directorate of the National Security Council. So Dan Sullivan supports fairly traditional Republican values and aligns a lot of his views with President Donald Trump. In recent news, he voted to confirm the SCOTUS nominee, Amy Coney Barrett. He claims his number one priority is to protect Alaskans, especially the most vulnerable, and says he's a devout military and family man. On the other side is Al Gross, the Democrat. So he initially began his campaign as an independent with the backing of the Democratic National Committee, but he later changed his party status to Democratic due to a court decision in Alaska. This was deemed to have hurt his campaign as he was relying on the votes of both Alaskan Democrats and independents. Alaska, surprisingly, has one of the largest independent voter populations in the country, and they have a fairly large say in the outcome of the elections. And so Al Gross supports pretty traditional Democratic values, although he's a strong defender of the Second Amendment, so that's one discrepancy in his views. Gross is a commercial fisherman and orthopedic surgeon, and his website speaks pretty extensively of how he paid his way through college through fishing, and prides himself as being 100% true Alaskan. He's also been known to gloat about how he shot a grizzly bear in true Alaskan fashion for self-defense reasons. And this is Gross's first time running for a major political position, which could both help and hurt him. Some of his supporters say it's time for a new face in Alaskan politics, while others want experienced politicians that they feel know how to get the job done. So why does this race matter? On a national level, this race matters as it helps to determine the makeup of the new Senate. Prior to these elections, the U.S. Senate was controlled by the Republicans. There were 35 Senate seats up for grabs in this election. If Al Gross were to have won, it would have flipped a Senate seat towards the Democrats, and this would have given the Democrats an advantage in passing laws that favor their policies. On a state level, this race would help influence what stance Alaska would take on various issues. Al Gross and Dan Sullivan have fairly differing views. If Gross were to have won this election, there may have been some more liberal changes to the state of Alaska. Historically, Alaska has been a red-leaning state for many years, and Gross winning this election would have been a pretty monumental feat for Democrats in Alaska. So what did the polls show in the months leading up to this election? In the early stages of this race, most polls actually showed a pretty tight race between Al Gross and Dan Sullivan. And so I chose to focus on 3 polls from August, September, and October, the months leading up to the election. The first poll I chose to focus on was one from August, which was a public policy poll, and it was rated about a B from 538.com. These showed that the two candidates were pretty much tied, with 43% of the vote for Sullivan and 43% of the vote for Gross. And this was pretty consistent with the earlier polls of the summer as well. In September, Harstad Strategic Research conducted a poll, although this poll only had a B/C rating from 538, so slightly less reliable than the previous one. This one started to show Sullivan pulling ahead with a slight margin, with Sullivan having 46% of the vote and Gross having 45% of the vote. In October, the New York Times/Siena College conducted a poll, and this poll had a rating of A from 538.com, so it's the most reliable, I would say, out of the 3. And this showed Sullivan pulling ahead by quite a bit more, with 45% of the vote for Sullivan and 37% of the vote for Gross. So what about the finances of this race? Al Gross was actually reported to have raised and spent millions more dollars than the incumbent Dan Sullivan. As you can see by the numbers I have posted on the slide, Dan Sullivan raised $9.6 million and spent about $7.7 million. And Al Gross was deemed to have raised about $16.8 million and spent about $13.8 million, so quite a bit more than Sullivan. And a good chunk of this was his own money. But many outside groups, grassroots organizations, and a new Alaskan super PAC called North Star donated large amounts to fund Gross's campaign. The race was actually deemed a quote-unquote money bomb by Jim Lotzfeld, who was a veteran political consultant in Alaska. Many Alaskans were actually pretty turned off from supporting Gross's campaign because of how much money was invested into it. They just thought that it was way too much money to be spent on an election, and it kind of undermined his everyday Alaskan approach to things. And so what about advertising for this race? There were heavy amounts of advertising on both sides for this race. Alaska was supposedly hit heavily with ads, and this actually angered a lot of Alaskans. Many of them just tried to ignore it and tried to be too busy to care about them, as they were just pretty annoying to most people. Many of the ads were attack ads from both sides, and they were common on social media such as YouTube. Gross often portrayed Sullivan as a corrupt politician who only voted in ways that favored his family's chemical business. And Sullivan often painted Gross as a liar who said one thing to please the public and says another to please the Democratic Party. There were also large amounts of TV ads, flyers, texts, and calls, with the majority of these being dominated by Gross. As you could see by the amount of money he spent in this election, a huge chunk of that was put in on advertising. There were also some positive ads from both sides, one of my favorites being Al Gross's Bear Doctor video. I can't play it in this recording, but I encourage you to look up Bear Doctor jingle on YouTube. It's pretty entertaining, and I think it'll get stuck in your head. So what was my prediction for this race? Although I loved Gross's Everyday Alaskan, I Shot a Bear campaign, I predicted that Sullivan would keep his seat as Alaskan senator. The most recent polls showed that Sullivan was leading slightly and projected that Alaska would lean Republican in almost all of its races, the presidential, the House, and the Senate. And Alaskan's Republican history also just made me choose Sullivan as a winner. It would have just been too much of an upset for Alaska to have switched to a Democratic senator. The state hasn't voted blue since Lyndon B. Johnson in the 1960s. I also feel that Sullivan's incumbent standing and political background just gave him an overall edge. And so what were the final results of the election? As you can see, with 92% of the precincts reporting, Dan Sullivan kept his seat as Senator of Alaska. He won with 54.4% of the votes, and Al Gross received 41% of the vote. I did want to note that it took over a week for them to call this race, because Alaska didn't even start counting some of their absentee ballots until Tuesday, November 10th. Apparently, Alaska's large size and various hard-to-access villages, just make ballot counting a lengthy process in the state. And so, as you can see, this race really was not as close as everyone was expecting it to be. And so I think that just says a lot about the accuracy of polls. So what are some of my final thoughts and overall conclusions that can be drawn from this race? Overall, I found this to be a pretty fun race to follow. There was never really a clear winner, and the race kind of always felt like a coin flip up until the end. I really enjoyed the two candidates, especially Gross. I enjoyed his campaign. I thought it was pretty entertaining. I also think it's pretty interesting if you look at these two candidates. I thought they compared a lot towards Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump in the 2016 election, in the way that Donald Trump is a political newcomer like Gross, and Dan Sullivan is kind of a veteran politician like Hillary Clinton. And so overall, I just found this to be a kind of fun campaign to follow, and I'll always have that jingle stuck in my head. As for political conclusions that can be drawn, this just shows that money can't buy an election. Gross raised and spent a significant amount more than Sullivan, but he still didn't win. And this also shows that polls cannot always be trusted. Although they did predict Sullivan to win, it was not by the margins that has actually occurred. I also did want to note that COVID did not seem to play a big role in this election. Gross is actually a doctor or orthopedic surgeon, and he advocated a lot for the expansion of healthcare and better COVID practices in Alaska, but he still didn't win the election. And so these are some of the sources I used, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you.